You may have heard of a Google artificial intelligence service called Google Notebook, where you can make folders online, upload documents to them, and then Google will do an AI analysis based on your questions or based on some automatic functions. Now, Google also has an automatic function where it makes a two-voice artificial intelligence chatty podcast about whatever you've uploaded. Today I've uploaded a press release from UCSF about a new paper about Alzheimer biomarkers and how payers view them, along with a new publication in JAMA by Deverka et al. That gives the original data. If you listen to this podcast, you'll hear how the AI voices have read and discussed the two documents. Here we go.
All right, so today we're diving into some pretty cutting-edge Alzheimer's research. The kind that could totally change how we approach this disease. We're talking about blood tests.
Oh, yeah, I've been seeing the headlines.
Right, they're everywhere, promising these earlier, easier diagnoses. But what happens when those test results, hit the wall of insurance coverage? And that's exactly what we're tackling in this deep dive. We're cutting through all the hype to give you the need-to-know info on these new tests, and crucially, whether insurance will actually cover them.
Which, let's be real, is the deciding factor for a lot of people.
Absolutely. It impacts whether these tests are a game changer or just another obstacle. So we've got a new article from JAMA, that's the Journal of the American Medical Association, and a press release from UCSF's Center on Policy Implications of Personalized Medicine. They're called TRANSCRIPT.
Okay, keeping it all straight.
Right, lots of acronyms. But first things first, these blood tests, they're not some sci-fi thing.
Yeah, for real.
They're happening, and they could be revolutionary. Imagine being able to analyze a blood sample and get a clearer picture of what's happening in the brain, potentially spotting Alzheimer's earlier than ever.
Wow.
That's the potential of these blood-based biomarker tests, BBMTs for short.
Catchy.
And this JAMA article suggests they could completely change how we diagnose this disease. And this is but the article mentions a $1,450 price tag for one of these tests.
Oh, okay, so not exactly cheap.
Not at all. And right now, insurance companies aren't exactly jumping to cover them.
Yeah.
So while the technology is amazing, accessibility becomes a huge question.
That's the heart of it, isn't it? Without insurance, these tests are simply out of reach for so many people. Imagine getting this life-altering diagnosis, but then not being able to afford the treatments that might come with it.
Right. It's like being told there's a map, but you can't afford to buy it.
Exactly. It creates a massive barrier to care and raises serious concerns about making existing healthcare disparities even worse. We've seen it time and time again with new medical technologies. The promise doesn't always reach everyone equally.
Right. It's like a double-edged sword. Incredible potential, but with a real risk of widening existing inequities. And the article points out the different ways these tests could be used. Of course, there's diagnosis, which we've touched on, but also triage.
Triage.
Basically figuring out who actually needs the more expensive and invasive tests.
Instead of just giving them to everyone right off the bat.
Right.
Interesting.
Like instead of going straight to Pics scans for everyone, these blood tests could help determine who those scans would be most beneficial for. And then there's even the idea of using them for screening. So we'll unpack all of these, but let's stick with diagnosis for a moment. It's particularly interesting with the recent approvals of new Alzheimer's drugs, like lecanemab and donanemab.
Right, we're following that.
But here's where it gets a little tricky, and I'm still wrapping my head around it. These new drugs, they actually require positive biomarker tests for people to enroll in the clinical trials. But, and this is a big but, the drug labels themselves don't actually specify which tests are good enough. So some could get a positive result on one of these new blood tests, but their insurance could say, sorry, that doesn't count when it comes to covering the actual treatment.
Oh, wow. So there's a disconnect there.
Right. It's like the system isn't quite aligned yet.
And that brings up a big concern with these tests, the potential for misuse. Easier testing means faster diagnoses and earlier intervention, which is great. But imagine inappropriate use where people who don't actually need these tests are getting them. It's not just about the cost, it's the potential anxiety and the burden on the healthcare system.
And it's not just a hypothetical concern, is it?
Unfortunately not. The article actually mentions a lab that's already marketing these tests directly to consumers.
Oh, wow. So bypassing healthcare providers altogether.
Which raises some red flags for sure about informed consent, the potential for misinterpreting results. People making major health decisions without talking to a doctor first.
It's like giving everyone a scalpel because surgery is cool.
Yeah, you need the training, the context, the guidance.
And speaking of guidance, the article really emphasizes the need for clear guidelines for doctors, especially primary care physicians, because they're often the first point of contact for someone experiencing cognitive issues.
Makes sense.
They need to know when to order these tests, how to understand the results, and when to recommend further testing. It's not just about having the test, it's about using it the right way.
Absolutely. We need a system that can handle this influx of new information, especially since there's a shortage of specialists in this field.
Right, exactly. And the article even mentions telemedicine as a potential solution.
Interesting. Could that be a way to make specialized care more accessible?
Especially in rural or underserved areas.
It's an intriguing possibility.
It feels like we're talking about a massive shift in how we approach Alzheimer's. And it's clear that simply having the test isn't enough. It's like,
Navigating a murky swamp.
okay, maybe not a swamp.
Maybe uncharted territory.
Uncharted territory. There we
Yeah.
go. That's more like it. So how do we make sure this technology lives up to its potential without creating more problems than it solves? That's what we'll explore next.
It is uncharted territory, and that's exactly why these conversations are so important. We need to be proactive about these challenges to make sure this technology actually helps the people who need it most.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the potential for misuse, the need for guidelines, the insurance hurdles, the lack of specialists. But let's zoom in on the science for a minute. How reliable are these blood tests, really?
That's the million-dollar question, and this is where the JAMA article gets really interesting. The strength of the evidence really depends on how the test is being used. Using a BBM2 to confirm a diagnosis in someone who's already showing symptoms is one thing, but using it to screen someone without any cognitive decline, that's a whole other story.
Because with screening, you're basically saying someone's high risk before they even have symptoms.
Exactly. And the article points out that the evidence isn't really strong enough yet to support widespread screening. There are just too many unknowns about how to interpret results in those situations and what it means for people down the line, both for individuals and for the healthcare system as a whole.
It's like you wouldn't want to send someone down a rabbit hole of worry based on a test that might not be giving them the full picture.
Right. And that's where the idea of triage comes in, which the article also talks about. Think of it as a way to figure out who really needs those more expensive tests, like the PET scans and spinal fluid tests.
So instead of those being the first step, these blood tests could help identify who those tests would be most beneficial for.
Exactly.
Sort of like a first-line screening to see who might need a closer look.
Precisely. And for that purpose, these blood tests could be really valuable, streamlining the process, potentially saving time, money, and a lot of unnecessary stress.
Okay, that makes sense. But then we're back to the insurance issue. The article mentioned that insurance companies are going to want to see strong evidence before they start covering these tests, right?
Of course. They need proof that these tests actually lead to better outcomes for patients. Does it mean earlier diagnosis, more effective treatments? Ultimately, do they save the healthcare system money in the long run? Those are the questions they need answers to.
Which makes sense from their side, but it feels like it leaves patients in a tough spot.
That's the crux of it, and it's why the authors are really pushing for more communication between researchers, clinicians, policymakers, and yes, even insurance companies. Figuring out a way forward means working together.
So ideally, what would that look like? What needs to happen to make sure these tests are used appropriately and fairly?
Well, first off, clear evidence-based guidelines on when to use these tests and how to interpret the results. And those guidelines need to be accessible and easy to understand for all healthcare providers, not just specialists.
Like a BBMT instruction manual for doctors.
Exactly. We also need to address the cost and insurance coverage head-on. We can't just offer these tests without a plan to make sure everyone can get them, regardless of their income or where they live.
And that's where policymakers come in.
Exactly. They have a huge role to play in encouraging insurance coverage, maybe looking at different payment models and even thinking about subsidies for people who can't afford the tests otherwise.
So it's not just about the science, it's about the whole system adapting.
That's it. And that's why I find the TRANSCRIPT press release so insightful. They're really focused on that translational aspect. How do we take these scientific advances and make them actually mean something for how we treat patients?
They're like the bridge between the lab and the real world.
Exactly. And they highlight how these tests could actually worsen healthcare disparities if we're not careful. They specifically talk about making sure underserved communities have equal access, especially since they're already disproportionately affected by Alzheimer's.
The last thing we want is a system where only people who can afford it can get these tests.
Exactly. And that's why they're calling for a multi-pronged approach. expanding access to telemedicine, increasing the number of dementia specialists, and addressing potential biases in healthcare that can affect diagnosis and treatment.
So again, it's not enough to just have the test. It's about having a system that helps everyone benefit from it.
Precisely, and that takes a real team effort.
Yeah.
But I'm cautiously optimistic. I think we can harness the power of these blood tests while making sure they're used responsibly and equitably.
That's the hope, right? To use this new technology to really make a difference in how we fight Alzheimer's. But as we've been saying, it's not as easy as just having a test. It's about having a system that ensures access equity and responsible use. It's like we're on the verge of something amazing, but we need to be thoughtful about how we move forward.
It's about being really thoughtful and strategic about how we move forward. And both the JAMA article and that transfers release really emphasize that. The need to constantly be assessing and reevaluating.
So we don't just roll out these tests and call it a day.
Definitely not. We need to track how they're being used, who's actually benefiting from them, are they actually leading to better outcomes for patients? And if we start to see disparities popping up, we need to be ready to adapt. Policies and guidelines need to be flexible enough to make sure everyone has equal access.
It's a process, not just a one-time fix.
Exactly. Things are changing so fast in this field.
That's for sure. And that's what makes these conversations so important right now. We have to really think critically about these blood tests,
Right.
about both their potential and the challenges they bring up.
Because the decisions we make today, those have a ripple effect.
They shape everything that comes next.
Precisely. And those decisions shouldn't be made in a vacuum. Patients, caregivers, doctors, researchers, policymakers, even the insurance companies. Everyone needs to be part of the conversation if we want these tests to live up to their full potential.
It really takes a village. But at the heart of it, it's about empowering patients, giving them the information and the access they need to make informed choices about their own health.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as Alzheimer's.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Alzheimer's, blood tests, and insurance, I think the biggest takeaway for me is this: it's an evolving story. There's so much potential here, but there's also a lot of work to do. We can't just sit back and wait for things to happen. We all have a role to play in shaping how this technology is used and making sure it benefits everyone. So I guess my final question for you is, what actions can people take right now, given everything we've talked about?
That's a great question. I'd say first and foremost, stay informed. This field is constantly changing, so keep up with the research. Have these conversations, read articles, talk to your doctor, and advocate for yourself and your loved ones. If you're concerned about cognitive health, don't be afraid to speak up. Talk to your doctor about these new testing options. And remember, your voice matters. Engage with policymakers, participate in research studies if you can. Make your priorities known, because together we can actually create a future where these advancements lead to a brighter future for everyone affected by Alzheimer's.
It's not just about the science. It's about action awareness and advocacy. That's a powerful message, and I think it's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey as we explore the complexities and the potential of these new blood tests. This is just the beginning of the conversation, so stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. We'll see you next time.